When did you first become aware of Joris' work?
Well, when I graduated from Bard College in June of '69, Robert Kelly, with whom I had worked on my Ceylon project, gave me two phone numbers in New York City. One was Paul Blackburn's, and one was Jerry and Diane's. And so as soon as I was kind of set up, and by chance I was on 7th Street and 2nd Ave, so I was in walking distance to Paul, and he was very important to me. And then I called up the Rothenbergs, who were way up on the Upper West Side in New York, 136th Street, somewhere around there, and they invited me up to come and meet them. And so I did. And it became this wonderful occasion where Paul was always ready with a glass of Spanish brandy, which he loved, and the Rothenbergs were then, as they are now, the totally hospitable people, with Diane cooking chicken, always had food for everybody who was there, be it me or 12 people. And Jerry and I began, talking a bit at that moment. Now, we weren't, I was just a very young poet, just out of college, beginning to do work, beginning to translate. He was already interested in the Ceylon work because he had done the New German Poets. But our really close meetings began happening in England in the early 70s when I was set up in London and when Eric Mottram invited Jerry and Diane to come to some of the events. And Jerry and I saw each other there again, but 73 and 74 and so on. And then in Paris, we would be hanging out with the Change people. And, all of a sudden, we were old friends with projects together. I think the way this came about was he brought out America, a Prophecy with George Quasha. And I remember having a discussion with him about the fact that, to me, prophecy was a tiny bit too religious a term, even though it was Blakeian. And that I had a vision of a book that I'd wanted to call Europe a Vision, as against America a Prophecy, to do a less spiritual, more materialistic book, in the sense that I come from a European tradition that has Marxism in it, that has, an anti-clerical, anti-religious aspect to it. Although, of course, what Jerry means with the spiritual is nothing to do with some kind of churchy thing, or even a T.S. Eliot high Anglican church thing. Obviously, it's the opposite. And so we began talking around a project of that order. And at the same time, I was telling him about another project I was thinking about with the Swiss-Italian poet Franco Beltrametti, who was a close friend, an anthology called Blows Against the Mother Tongue, that would put all the poets who wrote in other tongue than the mother tongue in, because to kind of overcome that notion that poetry can only be written in the mother tongue, a kind of romantic idea. And Franco, of course, passed away way too early for us to be able to do that project. And then, as I was wanting to come back to America, Jerry was helpful, and we were beginning to think of projects. We both had a great love and admiration for Kurt Schwitters. And so we thought, why don't we do Kurt Schwitters' book as maybe a kind of prologue to other collaborations. And so we did PPPPPPP, the title that was never able to be recorded as such with the official institutions, who calls it poets, plays, performance pieces, proses, the selected writings of Kurt Schwitters, but which really is called PPPPPPP, and we did that book together. And that was, a wonderful occasion. Then I had moved back by that time to this country. And I moved to California and was poet in residence at UCSD, where Jerry was teaching, and actually I lived in Encinitas, because we were beginning to think how to do these big anthologies that we had in mind. So kind of combination of America Prophecy and of Europe a Vision, and a wider, making it a whole global idea, and that became Poems for the Millennium. Which of Jerry's I saw, of course, was, after the small German poet booklet, was his big, major, the absolute book, which is Technicians of the Sacred. And that came up, the anthology that established what became known as ethnopoetics. And this was a global coverage, that book was, of the poetries of the so-called primitive peoples. That is, it was both the oral and the written ideogrammatic drawing, etc., written versions of poetries in a range of continents, i.e. everything that had been excluded from a post-Gutenberg canon of Euro formatted poetries. It was something that totally blew my mind, as it blew the mind of many, many people around, was that realization that what we take of as the great literary tradition of European writing, not only does it start with two oral poems, i.e. the Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but after that it narrows down, and you really have only this kind of core printed works. And then what Jerry's anthology brings to light immediately is that not only in the past, but in the present too, 95% of literary works, of poetry around the world is oral, comes in oral traditions, and in very complex traditions. And the mapping in his book was, okay, how now can we see this? Well, the 20th century art, not poetry alone, but the various art movements allow us now to actually recognize what otherwise had been unreadable, unlistenable to, unhearable, invisible, as literary, as poetic productions. You know, once you have concrete poetry in Dada, sound poetry, you realize that you don't have to have sonnets or alexandrins or hexameters in semantically perfectly and end rhyming lines to have a poem. But you can listen to chants. You can listen to wonderful, strange, non-semantic works, as Jerry shows very well in his translations of the Navajo horse songs. Once we are into an area of art where multimedia comes in, be it performance work, then obviously you're going to see that a work like a Navajo sand painting, which is a visual art, but that is accompanied by action, i.e. the making of it, that is accompanied by chanting, i.e. by music of 20th century art, from Dada to performance art, allows us finally to see vast ranges of activities in the past and the present, in other cultures, as, wow, that's poems, right? So that what ethnologically was looked at as a kind of shamanistic, weird healing activity, such as a Navajo sand painting, well, that is actually a complex artistic performance that involves drawing, painting, colorizing sand in very complex ways, plus music, singing, plus textual creation, narratives. And so this is a performance art area. So one of the things that Jerome does in Technicians is to make us aware of these areas. At the same time, you also are aware in there that in the translations and adaptations into 20th century Western art forms, we're losing something, i.e. possibly the healing activity of shamanistic actions is not translatable in that sense. On the other hand, you can also think of 20th century art and art in general as always being or having some kind of healing substratum, right? That there is some reason for it. I would think that if we think of the work of Joseph Beuys, we are clearly in an area that links strange, so-called primitive art forms and performances with very contemporary materials. I mean, what Beuys did was he took two non-artistic materials, felt and fat, which are two perishables, right? Not marble for Davids and, perennial statues. And they came to him, and that is maybe even private Beuys mythology, because supposedly shot down in the Crimea, he was saved by Tatars who wrapped him in felt and fat, which saved him from the cold in the winter during World War II, and he made those, so there's a healing process involved. So later on, when his work uses those materials, it has, at one level, they can be discussed purely as avant-garde art, and purely as a critical intervention in the materials of Western art. But they can also be seen or looked at as shamanistic, as having some element of shamanistic power in them. And I think it is to those areas that Jerry Rothenberg's work made us very attentive, opened us up to seeing the range of those things.
Okay, let's take
The poems for Millennium anthologies were immediately conceived as one huge book that we had to divide into 2 volumes because it would not be possible to do it as one volume. But the idea was to look at avant-garde and experimental art in the 20th century around the world. That is, from the previous work we had done, Jerry had done in ethnopoetics, I had done in other areas of work, my interest in Arab poetries, in North African poetries. I'd lived there for some time. The travels that we had done both made us aware that confining the notion of modernity to Euro-American event was again a kind of colonialism and imperialism that we absolutely rejected. And indeed, so one example, say, we do find a Korean poet who in the 30s was writing Dada poetry in Korean newspapers, right? Yeah, so that counts. That should be right there. That should be completely there. The idea is to show again and against the canonizers, against the Helen Wendlers of the world, that everybody, every nation, every non-nation, everybody makes poetry. And that which is interesting in that poetry is not the repetition of the older stuff, but is what is made up out of the necessity of the absolute present, of the contemporary, the extreme contemporary, to use Michel de Guy's phrase. You can go around the world and see that there is a tradition of the new that wonderful paradoxical sense, that we have. There's a book on painting called that, Criticism. But that is something that Jerry and I were completely and totally interested in to begin with, and to juxtapose those events next to each other. That is not just to have Ezra Pound there, but to have next to Ezra Pound an Arab poet who in Beirut in the early 50s is beginning to completely demolish the classical strictures of, imposed on Arab poetry, the way Pound was doing it 10 or 20 years earlier, and still then, in relation to the strictures of Anglophone, poetry, and especially British poetry, from the late 19th into the 20th century, and that is all what in French you could call même combat. The same fight, goes all over, and the fight has to do with this is a different world we live in, the 20th and now the 21st century world. We are not in an 18th century Newtonian world with, where Newton's laws are function and where billiard balls are the description of the geometries of the world, right? Their movements. We're in a post-Einsteinian world. We're in a world where the uncertainty principle, as worked out in physics, is also worked out in the arts. So that a Jackson Maclow poem that's based on playful moves that are not Newtonian law directed is much more accurate to the world than a fixed sonnet structure, filled with humanist ideas and materials. The problem is the canon, with that range of material, laying that over us, or imposing that as the great and the only possible poetry or art form, is the fact that this comes from people who feel very insecure about the present world, who want to live in a fixed universe, what our friend Eric Mottram in London used to call the kind of static, fixed world, with laws that are there, that are unchangeable, because so you move into an area where you feel safe because the laws are known. What is amazing, of course, is that the poets have known all along that this was not so. Even the poets that will be set in the canons, right? It was Keats who talked on a certain walk home from the Mummers play on Christmas 18, I can't remember, 17 or when it was, of negative capability, which is 100 years before the physics begin to do this. But that negative capability, that ability to stay in doubt without irritable reach for certainties and so on. That is modern physics and modern philosophy and contemporary thinking and contemporary art, right? Keats, the poet, is able to see that and to come up with that notion in the early 19th century. That is the kind of material that Jerry and I wanted to show as being core to the great achievements of art in the 20th century. So that we start, of course, by saying this is not something totally new. That is, as Jerry has showed in his previous anthologies, be it Technicians or Shaking the Pumpkin, the North American, Native American work, or with In America a Prophecy, the vast American anthology he edited with George Quasha. He showed that this kind of ideas have been going on and have been practiced all along throughout history. Now, the idea is again not to find a fixed origin, or to say all of this was done earlier on already. Oh, it was all done, but not in a fixed way. It was there, it was available, people did it. The fixities always only come in when you get into authoritarian cultural and political systems that say this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing, right? Those static visions of either art or politics. And so what Poems from Millennium wanted to do was to map those open, fluid, uncertainty-principled or unprincipled certainties, visions of the world. Now, of course, we put forerunners in there. So because, of course, we don't invent this on the spot. Keats is, what I talked about a moment ago, Keats's negative capability is core. But Blake is, of course, absolutely core. And you can go further back. You can go back to prehistoric cave art. You can go back to humans have always, at one level, somewhere, done art that is open-ended, explorative, experimental. The idea is, the way I explain this to my students often, is with an image that I picked up from Robert Kelly early on when I was a student. And Kelly said, he was actually putting down pop music. And he said in class, what would be the perfect cover for a pop album? And then he said a mirror. Because what you want to do there when you listen to this is you want self-recognition, identity. Oh, I feel exactly the same. This describes exactly how I am. So we extend that. You want to feel secure, that others are exactly the same as you, feel the same thing, think the same thing. And that, Robert would suggest, is the opposite of art. That is, art, sameness is the opposite of art. Art begins with difference. That is, art is the thing that if you go and experience it as a piece of music, as a painting, as a poem, is a dangerous thing. You go into it, you experience it, and you risk coming out different than you went in, not remaining the same. That makes art dangerous. It also makes it the most exhilarating experience you can have. Because the aim of art, and Jerry Rothenberg has that very clearly in one of his early manifestos, he says, I want to change your mind, right? That is what art is about. It's about changing you. It's not about reassuring you with sameness. Oh yes, we feel the same, we see the same, that is the way the world is, and if we are all together like that, we can warm the cockles of our heart in the sameness of blah blah. So the anthologies are again workspaces where we want to show the incredible variety of work in all these areas that people have done through time and everywhere in the world. As books, as constructs, they are, I think, what underlies both Jerry's and my approach to anthologies is the realization in a way, or the way at least I would put that the one great artistic technical change in the 20th century was collage. And anthologies, the way Jerry and I see those books, they're, if you want, our books. We are the authors of these vast collages where we put together bits and pieces from all over the place and construct a collage, so a work of art. So there is also that idea of making these books as works of art, not as Norton anthology teaching things, you know, that you are trying to put the best pieces together for the high school students or the college students, you know, different levels, you know. No, these are works of art that are massive collages, word collages, that are to be read in that way. That is also, you can go into the book any place, you can move in any direction in the book, the way you do that in a visual collage.
Great.
First to America, the poetry that I was interested in, and that was in full swing then, were the beats, of course. So I came because I knew of Bob Kaufman and Ginsberg and Kerouac, etc., and they have always remained close to me. And I was rather surprised when I arrived here, and 3 days later I was at Bard College, and Robert Kelly's first wife said, "You're the young poet, you got to go tonight to hear Robert Duncan read." So I went, and it was a very strange event because I was gotten myself drunk in the bar, and I came in late, and everything was full, and so I found a seat on the windowsill by the open window. It was September, it was hot, and then all of a sudden out came this man, Robert Duncan, in kind of Cape version, and with his great hand gestures, and began talking what to me sounded like a strange 19th century thing, and he began reading, and the way he directs himself with the hand, this was totally strange to me as poetry. And being somewhat high, I cracked up and got a fou rire and rolled myself out the window and left and went back to the bar. And it took a couple years to actually get to that aspect of American poetry. But something was clearly catching on, and I was beginning to read Kelly, and so I was looking at what is happening here, and they sent me to Olson. But then when I came to New York, there was Rothenberg, and so I looked, and then I began thinking around what Kelly and Rothenberg, a couple years previous, had been trying to formulate as deep image. Deep image by then had completely fallen off. We had a visit when I was still a student at Bard by Robert Bly, who claimed to be a follower of deep image, and that was kind of a sort of disastrous event. Kelly didn't actually want to be part of it. There was something not going on, and so I was in charge of Robert Bly, and so I picked up this man and took him to his room, where he took off his businessman suit, kept on the white nylon shirt, but put a serape, the Mexican serape that he pulled out of an attaché case, over himself, as this was the stage clothing, and then came and did this poetry. And I thought this was terrible. I asked him afterwards if he knew, about his French translations, and he said, "Oh, I don't know French really, so I can't really judge them." And I said, "What about the German ones?" Because I looked at his Rilke, and he said, "Oh, I don't really know German." And so the only thing I couldn't really check were the Norwegian ones, because I didn't know Norwegian, but it was terrible. So that had immediately compromised a notion of deep image, which was simply a term that was still coming up a bit here and there. Then I looked at some of Robert and Jerry's early thinking about this, and it was interesting there. What was interesting was that they were drawing on a heritage of a kind of a double poetics. At one level, on a surrealist heritage, where image is, of course, core. What is surrealism? What is a surrealist image? Is, well, the meeting on a dissecting table of an umbrella and a sewing machine, right? Not only do you have collage in that, of course, as the core technique, but you have a very strong image presence, right? Those three disparate objects there as one image. So deep image at one level to me was a notion of a complex image, of, and not a single image. Deep image was also, however, in another way, something that Robert and Jerry linked to Garcia Lorca, right? And so that would bring in the notion of deep image being connected to duende, i.e. to a kind of ineffable energy, power that would lie behind the image, and bring it up. I could connect it to Rilke, which is the way I also saw it. So, in fact, there was a very strong European root behind it to begin with. Now, I think what happened was that I think Kelly says this somewhere, the problem was not image, the problem was deep. Deep was maybe the wrong word, i.e. deep can be a very non-deep thing, right? Oh, that's deep, man, right? And I think that was what threw people off. And if you read Creeley's letters to Jerry on this, you will see that where that criticism comes in. And so Jerry and Robert, after a year thinking around this notion, and it generated some interesting materials. It generated poems of that moment that were good. Basically dropped that the concept. Let's not make a school of deep image. Let's move on with our business, which is writing poems and inventing new forms of writing poems. It was picked up by minor poets, in the Robert Bly mode, who then for a while made use of it. And if now you look up, that is what you get. You don't get Kelly and Rothenberg at the origin. You get Bly and company as somewhere there. I think there is more to it, and it is time maybe, and I think this is happening. I have one student, Pete Monaco, who is finishing his PhD work on deep image, on those moments and on those early deep image poets, and my friend and collaborator Peter Kockelberg, who's setting up a website right now to have all those magazines and texts available. Because of course those were little magazines where all disappeared. Those were correspondences that a couple of letters would appear in Matter or Trobar, or Floating Bear in those wonderful early Rothenberg or Kelly magazines. And then would disappear, and that we haven't seen since then. But I think for an archaeology of mid-20th century American poetry, and that is a major renaissance, I think this is material that should be available, and it will be good for it to be available. Work with oral literatures and with the so-called primitive comes out of that realization that he states at the very beginning of the intro to Technicians, which is that primitive means complex. That complexity, by the way, if I can go back for a moment to the talk about deep image, because it links to that. Jerry's complexity in thinking early on is not just, and his work is never just an image-based thing. Image would go to imagism, to Pound, and so on. But Paris literary parents, or parentage, I would pitch Pound and his width of thinking and his image-based work as the father, and Gertrude Stein as the mother. And I think this is also why something like deep image would never worked, or only worked for a year or two as a possible area of investigation, because Jerry always already then had that other line of thinking and work, which is via Gertrude Stein, which is a syntactical move, which is something that plays with surface, with repetition, that plays in a very different mode, rather than image, which is metaphor-based, right? And Stein's work is not metaphor-based. It is the opposite. And it is that wonderful doubleness. I mean, in a way, incarnated in the two people that we used to introduce Jerry 2 days ago. I read the Robert Kelly homage, and Charles Bernstein read the David Antin homage. And you can see Jerry also with those two core people from early on, Antin on one side, and Antin is, of course, Gertrude Stein, that kind of work, thinking through that, whereas Kelly is, of course, the work that sinks back via Olson to Pound and those traditions, right? So that is that double tradition that is Jerry. And all his work in that sense has moved through through that. So that, for example, if we want to go to ethnopoetics, and we think of that introductory sentence in the introduction for technicians, where he says primitive means complex. Where I see that complexity is exactly in the combination that Jerry is able to locate in this work as both image and syntax and multiplicity of procedure. It's not just an image or a deep image or even a superficial image or a metaphor for something else. It is also that whole range of juxtapositions of syntactical procedures that is something that functions differently from metaphor. That is, it is Pound, Olson, that thing, and it is Gertrude Stein to David Antim. So all of those, it is metaphor and it is discourse, if you want to put it in those terms, right? And that is where that complexity comes in, and that is what Rothenberg, as no one else, was able to see and to bring forth in those in what was limited to bad ethnopoetic translations or bad ethnological statements. Now, there are wonderful predecessors in that. I translated, as Jerry pointed me to it, I translated some Tristan Tzara, and Tristan Tzara has very core texts that at one level are Dada texts, or could be simply, made up, could be simply seen as classical Tzara Dada materials. In fact, Tzara found a range of ethnopoetic transcriptions already, we think, in Romania, or later, and then later on, and he used those, translated them, left some be as they were, played with them, and did a collection that he calls Les Poèmes Nègres. Marvelous workings of ethnological African materials. One can trace what Jerry does in ethnopoetics to some of his favorite early modernist poets. He asked me sometime in the early 80s, I think, to look at Tristan Tzara's work in that area, a sequence called Poèmes Nègres, which I found and then translated, and Jerry published in the second series of El Chiringa, if I remember correctly, and which I included in 4x1. Some of these are relatively straight translations, but slightly mixed in. Let me give you two examples. Here's a relatively straight one. This comes from Wapare tribe in Tanzania. I'm gonna rip me out a potato. A woodchuck's got strawberries. Horere hee hee. Haramnyanga hee hee. The woman here is the child. He arrived with the cattle. Horere hee hee. The woman here is the child. He arrived with the cattle. Horere hee hee. Haramnyanga hee hee. Woman, we are bringing your child. Forget your worries. Your child is here. So that's kind of, that includes straight translation and sound. But then he has in that collection a Maori poem from New Zealand, which, I'll read a little extract of it, goes like this. Ka tangi te kiwi. Ka tangi te moho. Ka tangi te tike. Ka tangi te tike he poko anahe to tikoko. Hare I te hara, and on, which in the first decades of the century, Zara left already in there as such, you know. So again, and I think this is Jerry would never claim that he is the originator in some absolute sense of something. This kind of material, this kind of work, the possibility to see those tribal poetries as valid today, as valid artistic constructs and actions, was there from the great, if you want, modernist masters like Tristan Tzara onward. Jerry, of course, built on that. You know, there are maybe 30 poems that Tzara did. Jerry did book after book, you know, and nearly and even critically formalized the workings and thought through them into what he calls ethnopoetics. You know, there is not only the anthologies, there is also the collection of essays that Diane and Jerry edited together. So there is a vast range of work being done there. And that work, to me, has always that wonderful doubleness of both it is anthology work and it is translation work, right? Because that other aspects of Jerry's, which is translation from different areas, different people, different times. He is a major translator. And of course, you have to be a translator if you want to be an anthologist of material that otherwise is not in the canon, right? Because it has to be translated. So if you have the language, then you can work on it. And certainly our ability to do poems on Millennium had to do with our ability to translate from a number of languages. You know, we had first experimented with that when we did the Pablo Picasso book. It was not first, I can't even remember exactly what the date of the Picasso book is, but when we did the Picasso selected poems together, Jerry took the Spanish work of Picasso, and I took the French work of Picasso, because Picasso early on wrote in Spanish, and then towards the end he wrote again a bit in Spanish, and of course mainly he wrote in French in between the time. And again, a wonderful demonstration that, you know, it is not the mother tongue as the only possible language of poetry. So that whole possibility of a necessity of translating and of gathering, you know, is core to the to that work. One of the masterpieces, although that is a word that we really have banned from our way of thinking about poetics, but one of the great achievements, one of those moments of wow, for me and for many people, was Jerry's workings of the Navajo poems, the songs. What he calls, the specific example, what he calls total translation. And it is a masterful presentation of what his whole thinking and working, theoretical and practical, of an ethnopoetics is. That is, the traditional ethnologist's approach is to look for meaning in primitive poetries. Is there meaning? I.e., can this be semantic? Is it semantically meaningful? What can I tell? Oh, yes, there is a story, and so on. Myth is a story, right? So you do that. Now, of course, Jerry came across these amazing pieces called the horse songs, you know, which were a Navajo poet, tale teller works. And looking at those, he realized that they had a number of elements. They were performance pieces that included singing, a purely musical work. They included nonsense syllable work, Tzara-esque vocalizations, and they included semantic work, i.e. a story was being told. Now, the classical 19th century and many 20th century anthropologists would strip those two first layers off the work and leave us with basic prose translations of, well, that is the story of, the young hero who goes to the sun to steal or to bring back the seeds of horses to the Navajos, etc. And then you get that myth story. And what Jerry did, and what is the complete genius of that level, is to recognize the work is not the semantic story. The work is all those elements, is the combination, is the whole painting of those, the integration of those elements, and so he decided to do a translation of all three elements. Very difficult thing to do because obviously the music, the Navajo music, the nonsense syllable, and the Navajo text are themselves integrated in specific ways to make the Navajo thing. Sound-wise, key-wise, the nonsense syllable play off the semantic syllables in some way, move around. So Jerry, when translating this, had to take all those aspects into consideration, And now I can't tell you at this point what he started with, which element he started with, or if he started with all three, knowing all three were there, working with his informant from the Navajo. But what he did finally was to come up with a total translation, as he calls it, where he gets a performance text that integrates the three elements. He sings them, and he has a key for each one of the Ho songs. Different from the Navajo key. He's not simply using the melody. He has created a new musical structure that fits in with the English nonsense syllables and the English semantic elements of the poem, so that you have a new complex work in, English and in beyond English. It is, because it has the sound and the nonsense, the vocalizing in it. That is, one of the really spectacular achievements of ethnopoetics are those elements. He's also found other techniques of doing certain works. For example, Native American works that would not be traditionally recognized by either anthropologists or poet scholars as being poems, because, say, there would be the repetition of a single word, or a kind of sing-song with maybe one word embedded in them. And being totally knowledgeable of 20th century poetries around the world, Jerry would immediately see, that has something to do with something that is being done now in concrete poetry, where a word can be singled out and something done with it and to it. And so for translating a poem that has singing and a single word in it, he, drawing on concrete and visual experiments, is able to create a page where you have the repetition of the song, hey-ya, 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 that becomes a full-based rectangle. And then, say, in the middle of that, you can have in red print or in bigger print inserted the single word crow or whatever it happens to be, right? And so that then you have a translation of the complexity of the original Indian poem in there, rather than, obviously you can translate it, poem, crow, right? He's able to show exactly, again, what he says early on, that primitive means complex. Dada strain. The zigzag mothers of the gods of science, the lunatic fixed stars and pharmacies, fathers who left the tents of anarchism, unguarded the Arctic bones strung out on Saint-Germain, like tom-toms, living light bulbs, aphrodisia. Art is junk, the urinal says. Dig a hole and swim in it. A message from the grim computer. Ye are hamburgers.
I'm going to get you to read that a second.
The holy words of Tristan Tzara. Sad in his world or in yours, he walks for years beside the economic lilies, explores the mysteries of bread. A wax archangel stands on his tongue, his hands cold, dry, deprived of water in the room under the room, where Lenin sat, aromas of Bukovina gather, Moinesti with its corn mush, brinza cheese, petroleum, red-headed Leia, like a hungry wolf. The word he dreams is Dada, Dada ice, Dada piano, Dada flowers, Dada tears, Dada pendulum, Dada vanilla, Dada Don Quixote, Dada humid, Dada archipelago, Dada pharmacy, Dada sexennial, Dada dichotomous, Dada dichroic, Dada dichrotic, Dada didactic, Dada Didelphian, Dada diluvial, Dada ding-dong. The fur of Dada stretched out in the sun, Dada on a hill, old fox, old Dada, Sammy Rosenstock alive, old exile, got Zurich on my mind, glass toys betwixt the stars with chains, electric flags and posters. Logic is a complication. Logic is always wrong, cries Dada. Holy cow, oh cube, oh hobby horse, the freedom first encountered in first trip to Zurich. Ghosts drunk on energy, they pulled the bells of war down, martyred the cabaret until it exploded like Yiddish Dada in the street, the overture to cheese. Oh Sammy, brother, the said one of your tribe, you said disgust. You sat next to the photo of red-headed Leia under the axe and clock, your monocle hung from your vest. Red life grew distant in the room where Lenin sat. The walls sang politics to us. His nurse's name was Dada, so was yours, and sputtered poetry, red bellies laughing through empty skulls. My name is Sammy Rosenstock. Samiro is later Tristan Tzara. I am so sad with life. I love it. I am, of course, Romanian. I allow myself to contradict. I put an owl in a hexagon. I climb up on the stage. I'm prim. I'm formal. I applaud the revolution. The hands of bandits, blind worms and Dada nightmares invade your bowels. Messiahs are passé. The word we dream is Dada. Dada sweepeth out. Dada teareth linens, rips clouds and prayers to shreds. Thou rides on hiccups. Dada has a balcony. We squat there. Pregnant birds, we shit on thine umbrella. Dada, Dada is against the future. Dada lives in fire, wisdom, fear. Is fear of Dada like a star? No, like a fish, a plant, the moon, a metal word, distorted, boiling, illumines the urethra. 60 fingers on each arm. I am a monster too. I play with cushions, singing, singing like hymns of queens. The eye of Lenin, now so wide, pushes the curtains. The chess game opens like a poem. Metaphysics of perdition rules them. Tired of the stars, his horse eats colored snakes. Oh, angel horse. On thee rides Hugo Ball, himself an angel horse. Here Rothenberg and Jung walk. Here Arp, here Janko. Here kings of Zanzibar. Here April nuns. Here Tristan Tzara, ghost of Abu Lafia. No ghost. He makes his buttocks jump like belly of Oriental queen. Madonna face of Emmy Hennings. A silent fiddle cuts the room in two. Hugo like a mannequin at piano.
I think.
Jerry, went to Dada as a core 20th century source for renewing poetry, politics, life. The Surrealists had been interesting and had taken over, but the same that I felt as a young man in Luxembourg in the 50s, growing up then, well, the Surrealists were being mannerist, and it was just literature. The Dadaists, and I think Jerry knew that early on, were not very present anymore, but were there in the background as a core force of 20th century possibilities that had been neglected, that had been somewhat done in by Breton, organizing the funeral of Dada in Paris, right? But the energy in the various fields that Dada created were still alive in the works, even if unrecognized. Dada, maybe the core movement, and I think Jerry would think along those lines too, would recognize that maybe one of those core liberating movements in the early part of the 20th, i.e. his century, in that, before the first great devastating blow of that century, World War I, Dada was the Occupy poetry moment of World War I in Zurich. The cabaret in Zurich, the Cabaret Voltaire, where the first Dada performance actions happened and readings and so on, is totally emblematic for the possibilities of art and of experimental work and of politically relevant work in the 20th century. And I think that is Jerry's recognition, and that is what he brings in. And they are never sad sack. That is, there is an incredible humor, despite the fact that we are dealing with the first occasion in our century where millions of people were killed in the Somme, in Verdun, and so on and so on. Those who were really opposed to it and those who showed why one had to oppose that stupid nationalism that had created the possibility where all these people, all these soldiers, died for absolutely no reason whatsoever. The only way that you could get to an understanding that the reasons for it were totally wrong, even if framed in logical ways, was to break logic down, was to move towards Dada, i.e. to say, no, there is no logic. If logic is what gets us to Verdun, then logic is wrong, right? That is a very strong, very core event of not just poetry, not just performance or the invention of performance art. It is a very strong core event in thinking, in thought, in philosophy, in thinking through the relation of thought, ideology, activity, politics, and so on. It puts into question everything that had brought World War I about, that is the previous centuries of bourgeois, nationalist, cultural evolution. And so I think the importance for Jerry was to see in Dada the emergence of a valid response to the disasters of the century, and to see it not only as a deep, serious production, but to see also the fact that it had that incredible humor, and that humor and outrageous, uproarious laughter was one of the, not just possibilities, one of the necessities to be able to get over the horrors that were that we were witnessing, that were going on at that moment. Poland, 1931, the wedding. My mind is stuffed with tablecloth, with rings, but my mind is dreaming of Poland, stuffed with Poland, brought in the imagination to a black wedding, a naked bridegroom hovering above his naked bride. Mad Poland, how terrible thy Jews at weddings, thy synagogues with camphor smells and almonds, thy thermos bottles, thy electric fogs, thy braided armpits, thy underwear alive with roots, O Poland, 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 Poland. How thy bells wrapped in their flowers tall, how they do offer up their tongues to kiss the moon, old mother, stuck in the sky thyself, an old bell with no tongue, a lost udder. O Poland, thy beer is ever made of rotting bread, thy silks are linens merely, thy tradesmen dance at weddings, where fanatic grooms still dream of bridesmaids, still are screaming past their red mustaches. Poland, we have lain awake in thy soft arms forever, thy feathers have been bound to us, thy pillows capture us like sickly wombs and guard us. Let us sail through thy fierce weddings, Poland. Let us tread thy markets where thy sausages grow ripe and full. Let us bite thy peppercorns. Let thy oxen's dung be sugar to thy dying Jews. O Poland, O sweet, resourceful, restless Poland. O Poland of the saints, unbuttoned Poland, repeating endlessly the triple names of Mary. Poland, 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 Poland. Have we not tired of thee, Poland? No, for thy cheeses shall never tire us, nor the honey of thy goats. Thy grooms shall work ferociously upon their looming brides, shall bring forth executioners, shall stand like kings inside the doorways, shall throw their arms around thy lintels, Poland, and begin to crow. Special about it is that Jerry writes that in the late 60s, early 70s possibly, in New York. It is clearly set way back. The title, Poland 1931, indicates Jerry's birth year. He's born in 1931. But the poem itself speaks of a near mythological 18th, 19th century Polish Jewish culture, right? So the first thing I think that becomes, that is surprising is that this is an extremely humorous poem about a cultural life that of course is no longer there. But he does not say anything about the disappearance of that culture. That is what came to be known as the Holocaust or the Shoah are not mentioned, right? This is going back to the culture of his grandparents. His parents immigrated, beginning of the century, from Poland. So this goes back, this is a look at a kind of nearly mythopoetic Jewish-Polish past. And he is refusing, in fact, to deal with what happened in between his birth and his writing of the poem, that is the 40s, really, and the final solution. Now, I think there are very core reasons for that. There is a sense in which I think the most serious writers on this have been very circumspect. Paul Celan, asked about what life was like in the 40s for a Jew in the Bukovina, said, everybody knows that, I don't need to talk about that, right? In those days in this country, there were some people who were talking only about that. And there was a funny phrase going around that says, there's no business like Shoah business. And Jerry, I think, very clearly did not want to go into any of that at that point. Because he didn't want to, because he hadn't found a way yet of dealing with it, of speaking to it. I can't say, and I won't say, I wouldn't take a guess on it. He had translated in the 50s Celan's Todesfuge, the Black Milk of Morning poem, the great poem on the Shoah. It is the poem that turned the German philosopher who had said, Adorno, who turned Adorno around. Adorno had said, after Auschwitz, poetry is impossible. You know, you cannot write poetry anymore after Auschwitz. And obviously Celan's poem had proved him wrong. And he eventually changed that statement, qualified it, and so on. Jerry said at some point, taking the counter of that, and said, after Auschwitz, only poetry is possible. That is, anything else is Geschwätz, is talk, is, you know, anything else does not have the power to deal with that, because poetry is the strongest, is the most dense, powerful human way of expressing things. So only poetry can really deal with something as Auschwitz. Only after Auschwitz, you can't just talk. It has to be poetry. So that's another very interesting, complex way of dealing with that situation. So what years after having written Poland 31 as a wonderful high comic mythopoetic poem about origins, real and imagined, Jerry and Diane travel to Poland for the first time. And so he's able actually to visit the places where the ancestors came from and realizes that the family or part of the family come from a small place right by Auschwitz. And it is after that trip that Jerry feels able and empowered enough to actually write a poem that deals with the extermination of a part of his family, and that deals with the extermination of the Jews during World War II. And that poem becomes the work we know as Horben. And again, I think, you know, one of the great masterpieces, if we still have masterpieces or want masterpieces, but one of the great poems of the late 20th century. And the choice of the title is very Rothenbergian. There is a refusal to use the word Holocaust, which is indeed a rather inaccurate term because it includes the notion of sacrifice. Every tense is sacrifice. That's the origin. There's no sacrifice, right, in the Shoah. He doesn't use the term Shoah, which is around, maybe because it has also been overused, misused, but he goes back to his own cultural heritage. The first language Jerry spoke in the Bronx at home was Yiddish. He learned English once he was able to go onto the American street as a kid, you know, so 4, 5, whenever, you know, but until then Yiddish was the Mama Lashon. The mother tongue gives him the word Horben, which simply means destruction, and which in that sense is a more accurate word than Holocaust or Shoah, which are already very metaphorically overladen words. Horben, destruction, is a word that in a way is totally accurate to one's inability to even conceive of what it meant to want to exterminate and millions of people because they belong to a certain race, tribe, whatever you want to call it, the Jews, or the Gypsies or so on. The very idea is so immense, so impossible, that a simple word like Churban, meaning the destruction, is really all that can describe it accurately. So I've always felt that this was the choice of the title was important, was central, and immediately pitched that poem in a very specific way and gave it an accurate pitch. Word, Churban, all their lights went out. Their words were silences, memories, drifting along the horse roads onto Malkina Street. A disaster in the mother's tongue, her words emptied by speaking, returning to a single word, the child word, spoken, red-eyed on the frozen pond, was how they spoke it, how I would take it from your voice and cradle it, that ancient and dark word. Those who spoke it in the old days now held their tongues. Ois Ladykin, the emptying. At Honey Street in Ostrava, where did the honey people go? Empty, empty. Miodova, empty, empty bakery and empty road to Warsaw, yellow wooden houses and houses plastered up with stucco, the shadow of an empty name still on their doors, shade and shadow shattering the mother's tongue but empty, the way the streets are empty where we walk, pushing past crowds of children, old women airing themselves outside the city hall, old farmers riding empty carts down empty streets, who don't dispel but make an emptiness, a taste of empty honey, empty rolls you push your fingers through, empty sorrel soup dribbling from their empty mouth, defining some other Poland. Lost to us, the way the moon is lost to us, the empty clock tower measuring her light 4 ways, sorrel in garden, mother of God at roadsides, in the reflection of the empty trains, only the cattle bellow in, like Jews, the dew-eyed wanderers, still present, still the flies, cover their eyeballs, the trains drive eastward, falling down a hole, a holocaust of empty houses, of empty ladders leaning against haystacks no one climbs, empty Ostrava and empty Ostrolenka, old houses empty in the woods near Vyshkov, dachas the peasants would rent to you and sleep in stables, the Bialo forest spreading to every side, retreating the closer we come to it to claim it, empty oaks and empty fir trees, a man in an empty ditch who reads a book the way the Jews once read. In the cold Polish light, the fathers sat there too, the mothers posed at the wood's edge, the road led brightly to Treblinka and other towns, beaches at Brock, along the Bug, marshes with cattails, cows tied to trees, past which their ghosts walk, their ghosts refuse to walk, tomorrow in empty fields of Poland, still cold against their feet, an empty pump backwater drips from, will form a hill of ice, the porters will dissolve with burning sticks, they will find a babe's face at the bottom, invisible and frozen, imprinted in the rock.
Very well read. If you could
Try the scream. Erd, sollst mit zudecken mein Blut und soll mit kein Ort sein vor mein Geschrei. Job 16:18. Practice your scream, I said. Why did I say it? Because it was his scream and wasn't my own. It hovered between us, bright, to our senses always bright, it held the center place. Then somebody else came up and stared. Deep in his eyes there found a memory of horses galloping faster. The wheels dyed red behind them. The Poles had reserved a feast day, but the Jew, locked in his closet, screamed into his vest a scream that had no sound, therefore spiraled around the world so wild that it shattered stones. It made the shoes piled in the doorway scatter their nails. Things testify, the law declares it. Shoes and those dearer objects like hair and teeth do by their presence. I cannot say that they share the pain or show it, not even the photos in which the expression of the dead shine forth. The crutches by their mask, the prosthetic limbs by theirs bear witness, the eyeglasses bear witness, the suitcases, the children's shoes, the German tourists in the stage set. Auschwitzim had become the letters over its gates, still glowing, still writ large, Arbeit macht frei. Hotel and gastronomic bar, the dissolving, indifferent to his presence, there with the other ghosts, the uncle grieving, his eyelids turning brown, an eye protruding from his rump, this man whose body is a crab's, his gut turned outward, the pink flesh of his children hanging from him, that his knees slide up against. There is no Holocaust for these, but Chorben only. The words still spoken by the dead who say, my Chorben and my children's Chorben. It is the only word that the poem allows because it is their own. The word as prelude to the scream, it enters through the asshole, circles along the gut, into the throat and breaks out in a cry, a scream. It is his scream that shakes me weeping in Auschwitzim, and that allows the poem to come.